All right, so our second speaker, again remote and again further, I think, away in time. So thanks, Alisa Pearson, for joining in from the Eastern time zone. Now we're going west to the Pacific time zone. As I was saying, the next speaker is Magnus Egerstedt, the Stacy Nicholas Dean of Engineering and professor in the Electrical and Engineering and Computer Science, as well as the Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering departments at the University of California, Irvine. I think it's needless to say that he has worked extensively on the control of multi-robot systems, but recently he has explored the world of ecologically inspired robots. And I think that's what we're gonna listen to in this talk. So Magnus, you should be co-host and be able to share your slides already. So whenever you're ready, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Gennaro. And I think I am ready to go. Let's see if that works. Are we good?
Yes.
Excellent. So thank you for this introduction. I am going to give a talk that is semi-irrelevant, perhaps, to the theme of the workshop, but something that I've gotten extraordinarily excited about over the last handful of years, and that has to do with thinking about teams of robots and people working together based on the types of interactions you find in nature. You may have heard names or terms like symbiosis or mutualisms. So these are relatively well-defined collaborative arrangements found in nature. And the question is, can we take some of these ideas and deploy them on teams of robots for the purpose of having people and robots coexist elegantly together? And I should point out that this is a truly collaborative adventure. I'm working with a sloth ecologist, John Powley from the University of Wisconsin, Madison. And the backdrop for this work is really this idea of how do you actually engage with multi-robot systems? And by now, human swarm interactions or humans controlling multi-robot systems, I wouldn't say it's mature, but certainly no one gets shocked if you write a paper about lots of robots and a person engaging with them. And there are two dominant interaction modalities that have really emerged. One is really the human as commanders, where you have a person or multiple people with joysticks of some sorts controlling actively the robot. This could be teleoperation. This could be, you're taking over the steering wheel of a self-driving car and now you're driving it. That's the human as commander modality. The other side that we've seen is really the idea of the human as bystander. The robot is doing something and asks for help when they need help. Or the system thinks that the robot just isn't doing a good enough job and returns authority to the human. So the human is playing a passive role unless called upon. So if you look at something like, I don't know, level 3 autonomy in an autonomous vehicle, that would have a little bit of human as commander and a little bit of human as bystander mixed into the mix. What we're seeing now, though, is a push towards something that's neither commander nor bystander, and that's this idea of humans as team members. You have teams truly of robots and humans working together, and this has triggered a relatively new set of research questions that all have to do with this idea of humans and robots on the same team, let's say playing soccer. This was the recent faculty-student soccer game that happened at UC Irvine 2 weeks ago. And the faculty, we won for the first 10 minutes, and then we get old and tired, and the students just kept going. But that's not the point. The real point here is a lot of questions emerge that I think are interesting, right? So if you look at the traditional field of team theory, what constitutes effective human teams? There's a lot of work done there. Trust plays a big role, but what does trust really mean when it comes to robots? This is something that's still a little unclear. Do you trust a class of robots? Do you trust individual robots? And trust is intimately linked to this idea of cognitive models. A lot of times trust is a function of other agents behaving as I'm expecting them to behave. Alyssa was talking about unreliable actors. that requires cognitive models to be able to say something like this. So this idea of how do you build effective cognitive models that allow you to trust other actors, where the other actors may or may not be humans or may not be robots. There's a whole new paradigm of training. So how do you train teams of humans and robots together? The Department of Defense obviously is very interested in this idea, and you know, things having to do with interfaces. What I've gotten excited about is really this idea of interspecies collaboration. Why in the world would we think of robots as people and then go to classic team theory? Aren't there things we can learn from how canine teams are composed, for instance, where dogs work together with human handlers and even more, right? Why should robots be dogs? Why shouldn't they be something else? So is there something that we can learn about interspecies collaboration that is applicable to teams of human multi-robot systems? And core to this is somehow we're different, right? So heterogeneity really is going to have to play a role when we start to untangle this idea of interspecies collaboration. And you know, you can find different axes of heterogeneity in robotics. We like typically to talk about different sensing modalities. This could either be quantitatively different, so I have a sensor that can see short and Gennaro can see far, or different kinds of sensors. I can see heat maps, but Gennaro can see point clouds, say. Mobility is another. You can either be fast or slow or air ground, different communication capabilities and different computational capabilities. You can, of course, imagine other types of heterogeneity axes as well, but these four are the standard ones. And one thing that we're still kind of scratching at the surface of here is, first of all, if you have a collection of robots with different capabilities, how do you design for that? Arguably, this is the most well understood of these questions. A lot of times you put it in a giant optimization problem and you turn an NP complete crank and out comes, if you wait long enough, some kind of solution. But that's, you can do that. But fundamentally, there are lots of things we don't understand about heterogeneity. Like, what is it good for? You know, why is it better to have a slow robot and a fast robot working together? Or is it? And how much better is it? Can we measure it? Something I really like is to get heterogeneity to be an answer rather than a spec. So here's a problem. You know, compose a team of robots that, and then the answer is, here is what it should look like. And clearly there are reasons why heterogeneity is good, because nature is, as you see here in this realistic picture, filled with different kinds of things. I also think roles are fascinating, and roles are not necessarily, when we're morphologically different, we have the same general build. We're, you know, yay high, humanoid bipeds, but we still do different things. And roles are fascinating because there is a lot of studying done when it comes to organizing principles in societies of different kinds of animals. This chart I ripped from an astrobiology paper, but we see things like the smarter the animal is, so EQ and encephalization quotient. This is the brain to body mass ratio that apparently is an interesting measure of intelligence. But the smarter an animal gets, the smaller the group sizes tend to be. Right? So ant colonies are significantly larger than dolphin pods or lion prides. But you also see the degree of specialization going up as the animal gets smarter. Dolphins have really crisp and well-defined and dynamically evolving roles in their pods. Fascinating. There are scouts and there are protectors and there are a lot of different roles in these pods. So roles emerge as a function of intelligence. The exception is the hummingbird, which actually is the smartest animal on the planet, according to the EQ definition. So ignore the hummingbird. Having said that, you know what? This is how we tend to think about robots generally when we discuss multi-robot systems. We think in terms of insects, ants and bees, right? Really dumb robots. But you know what? Why shouldn't we think about and look to dolphins? Our Our robots have serious computational capabilities. Maybe it's time to go beyond ants and bees and fish when we think about how to structure these systems, which brings me to this idea of mutualisms. And in particular, I'm going to seed the conversation around mutualism through coverage control. I like coverage control. I've liked it for a long time. Here is coverage control as an interaction modality where you have a person on the side of the field with an iPad, basically painting densities in the environment. And instead of controlling individual agents, you're controlling fields or densities, and the robots respond accordingly. This was actually a project sponsored by John Deere, where they were deploying swarming tractors, so teams of tractors. And the question is, what should the farmer at the side of the field be doing? And this was our proposal. The point, though, with coverage control is that it's really, really quite rich. You can do a lot of multi-agent things through the lens of coverage control. I'm not saying it's the only game in town, but it is a rich enough way of thinking about a lot of coordinated behaviors that I am going to use it to see the conversation here. So here's an example, for instance, of a team of robots doing something that looks like formation control. They're spelling UCI, but it's really just density functions, right? So coverage control can do this. We've looked a lot at this question of different sensing modalities. So let's say you have densities that are different kinds. You have gas, you have luminosity, you have temperature, and some robots can measure temperature and gas. Some robots can only measure luminosity and so forth. Then you can get different kinds of distributed behaviors in response to these qualitatively different sensing modalities. Lately, I've taken a step back, though, and started asking questions fundamentally about where are the decision points when you're doing coverage control. So the typical ingredients are, you have a region with some kind of densities to be covered. So densities matter. And then you divide this overall region into regions of dominance. Picture 2 here, these are lion prides in Tanzania, and they have these region of dominance type of structure where a different pride controls a certain territory. So you need some notion of, this is the area I'm in charge of. And then you need some quality of coverage. How well is that area being covered, or points in that area being covered? The fourth ingredient is a cost, and it almost always looks like a sum over an integral over the regions. Then you integrate over the quality, you have the density, and that's it. And then you need a mobility strategy, to some way of taking this cost and making the robots minimize it or maximizing it. So for instance, in the situation where we're looking at mobility, you can look at things with robots with different maximum speeds. By the way, I should say, I saw that there was a very elegant timer that was counting down. I can actually not see it while I'm in presentation mode. So if someone jumps in when it's when I'm getting low on time, I will just wrap up. Gennaro. Anyway, so let's assume that we have, for instance, a distribution of robots. They have different speeds, and now it's not a traditional coverage control. Let's think of, for instance, fire trucks, and you want to spread the fire trucks across an area so that they can respond to fires as quickly as possible. And fast fire trucks should be in charge of bigger areas, right? So you no longer have standard Voronoi diagrams. You get these really weird looking multiplicatively weighted Voronoi diagrams where a particular agent is in charge of an area where that agent can get the fastest, right? So with that, you can now, for instance, define the cost as the sum over how long it takes to get to a particular point squared. You can compute gradients, you can flow in negative gradients this directions, and you can do things like coverage control where speed matters as opposed to sensor coverage. The point, though, is that through these 5 different ingredients, densities, regions, qualities, costs, and update laws, you can actually capture a large portion of different kinds of heterogeneous qualities. Having said that, what exactly is going on here? Well, I wrote this, right? I have a sum over an integral of the quality, blah, 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 blah. Literally, the whole is by definition equal to the sum of its parts. I have a sum of its parts, right? This is coordinated. I move in such a way that when I move and Gennaro moves, we're covering our regions of dominance properly, and we're taking care of where the other person is. So we coordinate our behavior, but we don't benefit anything particular from this as a whole, from this way of doing things. That seems problematic. So another way of thinking about this is, let's say you have two robots and you have two target points, right? So you have the red X's here. And then there is this little step. So what you would do if you do classic task assignment is you would take the triangle robot, push it towards the point that's closest to it. You take the square robot and push it closest to the point that belongs to it. That is the normal solution to this coordinated task assignment. If you don't want to do that, put little densities there and call it coordinated coverage control. This is what coverage controllers will do. Every coverage controller on the planet will result in this solution. But you know what? Any kid will look at this and say, you know what? Drive the triangle over to the right, have the square drive up on the triangle and get to the upper ledge. Now it sits there, then have the triangle go to the point to the left. That is collaborative, because all of a sudden, by teaming up, the robots now did things they couldn't do before. And that is not captured by an integral or a sum of its parts. There's something different going on here that is collaborative as opposed to what I've started referring to as coordinated. So that brings us to mutualisms. Nature is filled of these triangle and square robots here. So here we have, for instance, an impala, this little buffalo-looking thing with a red-billed oxpecker bird on it. It's hanging out on this impala, and it eats ticks. So the impala gets rid of the parasites, and the bird gets to eat. Right? Sloth is fascinating. The three-toed sloth has flightless moths in it. It looks like little ants or something, but they're actually moths that tend to algae in the fur that then in turn the sloth eats. So it's a three-species mutualism. You have this really, really wonderful example of badgers and coyotes. So they both like to eat squirrels, ground squirrels, and badgers are really good at digging them up, but they're not particularly effective hunters. Coyotes are not very good at digging, but they're really good at tracking down and hunting the squirrels once they're on ground. So in Michigan, they keep observing this on a particular peninsula, badgers and coyotes teaming up so that the badgers dig and the coyotes hunt, and then they both get to feast on these ground squirrels. There's also an example, ants and aphids are a very crisp example where ants will paint aphids with pheromones so that other ants know that they belong to me, just stay off. So the aphids are protected. And as a favor to the ant for this protection, they provide sucrose, so sugars. From a coverage control point of view, what's going on here, right, is you have a certain squirrel density if you're a badger, but all of a sudden, if a coyote shows up, the density goes up because together we can capture more squirrels. So this would be an example of how you really need to redefine this whole notion of densities as a function of who is around. And as Gennaro hinted at, I've gotten increasingly excited about ecology as a rich generator of behavior in robotics. And my pandemic project was to write this book on robot ecology. So this idea of what can we learn from robotics. Here's one possible way of thinking about this coordination versus cooperation or collaboration in coverage control in general, or more broadly in teaming. And me being who I am, I'm going to talk about barrier functions for that. So you have some cost, right? So it's a cost as a function of something we're going to do. I'm going to call this the coordination cost. This could be the locational cost in a coverage controller, for instance. You can squint and imagine pretty much anything there. And then you have some kind of notion of individual capabilities. In this particular picture that my current student, Sobum Kim, has produced, you have rabbits that can be on land. So they can only be in the gray areas. And then you have turtles that can be both on land and in water. They're amphibious. So this can be encoded through constraints. Here is where you can be, and you can be quite general in terms of how you define these constraints. So this would be the coordinated way of thinking about coverage control, for instance. You have these constraints and you do this. But you know what? The rabbit can ride on the turtle across the river. Right. So what you can do is to get to collaboration is to change the constraints so that agent one, let's say the rabbit, it has its constraints, composed with the way it can interact with the turtle. And this composition operation, which we now, I think, have a fairly crisp handle on what this looks like, allows the rabbit to ride across the river when it is moving together with the turtle. And then similarly, for the turtle in general. And this is a way through the composition of these constraints to encode mutualistic capabilities and get to collaboration. And I am very, very excited about as a direction. I should say, though, that there are tons of things that we, and when I say we, I really mean I, don't understand about this idea of mutualisms in robotics, right? So first of all, how do they evolve? Where do they come from? I mean, there's ideas about repeated prisoners' dilemmas, kind of game theoretic formulations, maybe. Ecologists are really thinking hard about how do you actually get to mutualisms, but just understanding their existence is something that I think is not yet understood. And then when it breaks, right? I mean, lack of trust is it's clear that badgers are going to stop teaming up with coyotes if every time a ground squirrel is dug up, the coyote eats it and goes, yeah, sorry. So clearly there is also not just the creation, but the breakdown of them. I really like this idea of asking questions of how do we engineer mutualisms in our teams? And this really goes to this question of interspecies team theory. We don't necessarily have a particularly general idea about interspecies team theory. We understand a lot about human teams. We understand a little bit about dogs and humans, but general species, we don't know. Squirrels and humans, there isn't a team theory for squirrels and humans. Or bees, right? Do you trust individual bees, or are you afraid of all bees, right? So all of the standard notions, it's not clear that they hold anymore. And then ultimately, what does it even mean to be a robot species? People have talked a little bit about this, including work that we've done, so me and Gennaro, amongst others. But that almost always boils down to, here's a task. Well, for that task, I need certain capabilities. Well, for those capabilities, I need certain features, certain sensors, certain ways of acting on the world. Well, for that, I need agents with certain types of sensing and interaction or actuation modalities. But we don't start with tasks when we talk about species in nature. We don't say, are these two the same species? That we can answer without starting with the question of tasks. So some notion of robot species that it's task independent, we really don't have. And I think that's a fascinating question. So with that, I am going to wrap it up and just say thank you. And like I said in the beginning, I worked a lot with John Pauli, who is a sloth ecologist. So if there was something you liked, it was probably thanks to him. And if there were things you didn't like, I recommend that we blame Gennaro and Riku for inviting me to give this talk. Thank you. By the way, there's something so sad about virtual applause. There's this one hand clapping and that's it.
Hello, Professor Egerstedt. My name is Chen Chenyo from Taiwan. It's a really inspiring and informative talk. But I have a question about the heterogeneity, because when we talk about the coverage control in the Voronoi partition, all the agents in their cell, they will not interact with each other. So if like for the turtle and the rabbit, are they in the same partition or they will be in different partitions so that they will interact with the different agent in the same system? Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's exactly the right question, right? So the way we normally do heterogeneous coverage is exactly like you said. We have regions of dominance. I'm in my region, you're in yours. And that's why I called it coordinated, because we coordinate our actions, but there's really no real profound collaboration like the rabbit and the turtle. And that's why you have to break it. So instead of minimizing that cost straight up with Voronoi partitions, you're going to have to do it through things like constraints where you're allowed to actually be on top of each other if you're a turtle and a rabbit. So that was my possible path forward, but you hit the nail on the head, right? Whenever you write things down as a sum of individual things and there is no real interaction beyond this coordination, you're missing this next level of collaboration that I am now calling mutualism. You can call it whatever you want, but I do think No, you're right. Stop talking and say that.
So, okay, thank you, thank you.
Hi, Jen Chung from the University of Queensland. Thank you for the talk. Lots of interesting ideas. So there's this idea of mutualism kind of is very closely linked to tight coupling between agents. And these are notoriously difficult to discover these kinds of behaviors. It was probably one of the things that you listed on that last slide, but what are your ideas on how we could discover these for artificial agents?
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And in fact, there is a sub type of mutualism known as symbiosis, which is a mutualism that persists over time in a very tight spatial location. So think like, lava or moss that grows on trees, right? That's symbiosis, and it's a form of mutualism. I've worked with a dolphinologist, and there they do things like they just count interactions, but it's tricky, right? I mean, there's work done on what zebra belongs to what herd, and again, it all boils down to basically counting things, empirically counting things. To me, that doesn't seem like the right way to do it. So instead, if you have a clever suggestion, I am all ears. So I'm going to dodge that bullet and say, it's a good question. It's a hard question, and I don't think it's solved.
All right. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
All right. I think in the interest of time, let's thank Magnus again and move to the next speaker.
Thank you.
I think he gave a lot of hints for maybe the panel discussion. So if you are, if you want some of these things being discussed, go to the Q&A webpage on the workshop website and write your question to the panel